I still remember the exact moment I realized something in my life had quietly gone off the rails. Not in a dramatic explosion, but in that slow, unsettling way where you can feel a boundary being ignored right in front of you, and nobody else seems to care. It was a Sunday morning in late April in the small town of Westbridge, Connecticut, and I was standing on the front steps of my house, holding a mug of coffee watching strangers walk across my lawn like it was a public walkway, and not the front yard of a home I had worked my entire adult life to afford and maintain, and what made it worse was the calmness of it, like nobody even considered they might be doing something wrong. My name is Daniel Harper, and my wife Elise and I bought this property back in 2009 after leaving Boston because we wanted something slower, something quieter, something that did not feel like every inch of life was being consumed by noise and pressure and competition. We found this place almost by accident, an old farmhouse built in 1890, sitting on nearly 2 acres with tall maple trees that turned gold in the fall and a wide stretch of grass that felt like breathing room after years of apartment walls and traffic and sirens, and for a long time it really did feel like we had made it, like we had finally stepped out of the rush and into something human again. Right next door to us stood St. Andrew's Chapel, a modest but well-loved local church with a small parking lot and a congregation that had been there longer than most of the current residents of the town. Elise and I never had any issues with them. In fact, we had a friendly relationship with the previous pastor, an older man named Pastor Raymond, who would sometimes wave to us while gardening and occasionally stop by our fence just to talk about weather or town events. There was a sense of mutual respect, even without much interaction, and I never once felt like the church and our property were in competition for space or peace. It all coexisted the way small town life is supposed to coexist, quietly and without friction. That started to change in 2016 when Pastor Nathan Cole arrived. He was younger, energetic, always speaking like he was trying to lift the entire room higher than it already was. And at first, that energy seemed like a good thing. The church became more active. There were new programs, new gatherings, more events, more people arriving on Sundays and midweek evenings. And you could feel the place becoming more alive, which I honestly did not resent at first, because I thought growth in a community institution was something to be celebrated, not feared. But what I did not anticipate was how quickly growth can spill beyond its own borders when it is not carefully managed. The first sign was almost laughably small, just a couple of people stepping off the church driveway and cutting diagonally across our lawn instead of walking around to the sidewalk. I noticed it one morning while watering the edge of the yard, a man in a blue jacket walking across the grass with a coffee in one hand, looking at his phone, not even noticing the line of flower beds Elise had planted the week before. And I remember thinking maybe he just did not realize, maybe this was a one-time mistake. But then it happened again the following Sunday, and then again, but with more people, and what had been a couple of isolated shortcuts slowly turned into a visible worn path across the lawn, like someone had drawn a line through our property and others simply decided to follow it. Elise noticed it before I fully admitted it to myself. She was the one who had planted most of the flowers along that stretch, and I remember her standing at the kitchen window one Sunday morning, just watching in silence as group after group crossed the yard. She did not say anything at first, but later that day, she told me quietly that it felt like watching someone slowly erase something you built with your own hands, and I did not have a good response to that because she was right. Every week the damage became more visible: flattened grass, broken stems, muddy tracks, even trash left behind, coffee cups, napkins, the occasional bottle. And what bothered me most was not even the physical damage, but the ease with which it was happening, like our property had become invisible simply because it was convenient for other people to ignore it. I tried to stay calm about it for a while. I told myself small towns have these quirks, people take shortcuts, maybe it would settle down on its own, but it did not settle, it expanded. And by the summer of that year, it was no longer a few individuals, it was entire groups, families walking together, kids running ahead, dogs pulling on leashes, people laughing, talking, completely unconcerned with the fact that they were crossing private land. And every Sunday the lawn looked more like a public walkway than a private yard, and I could feel something building inside me, not anger exactly, but a kind of slow disbelief that this was happening so openly without hesitation. The breaking point came one Sunday morning when I was outside trimming hedges, and a group of maybe 20 people walked across in a line directly through the middle of the garden Elise had spent weeks restoring, and one of them even stepped directly on a newly planted section without slowing down, and I remember standing there holding the shears, just watching them pass like it was the most normal thing in the world, and something in me finally clicked. That this was not going to fix itself because nobody involved seemed to think anything needed fixing. That afternoon, I walked over to the church after service ended and waited near the side entrance until Pastor Nathan Cole came out. He greeted me warmly, like usual, friendly smile, open posture, and I tried to keep my tone steady when I said, "Pastor Cole, I need to talk to you about something. Your congregation has been cutting across our property, and it is damaging our yard and gardens. I would appreciate it if you could ask them to use the sidewalk instead." He nodded almost immediately and said, "Of course, Daniel, I completely understand. I will mention it during announcements." And for a moment, I actually believed that would solve it, because I wanted to believe it would be that simple. But the following Sunday, I stood on my porch again and watched even more people cross than before, like nothing had been said at all. And that was the moment I realized I was no longer dealing with ignorance. I was dealing with disregard, and there is a difference between the two that changes everything, and that is when I told Elise that I was going to speak to someone who understood property law, because if polite requests did not matter anymore, then something more formal would have to. After that first meeting with the pastor, I kept telling myself that things would correct naturally, because that is what reasonable people want to believe about the world, that once something is made clear it will be respected. But what I did not understand yet was how quickly habits become invisible to the people repeating them, and how once a pattern feels normal, it becomes almost impossible to see it as wrong even when someone else is clearly being affected by it. I called a property attorney, a woman named Margaret Ellis, who had a reputation in town for being calm, but extremely precise, the kind of lawyer who does not waste words because she does not need to. And I remember sitting in her office with Elise beside me, going through everything from the beginning: the first few crossings, the growing groups, the ignored request, the damage to the garden, the trash, the worn path through our lawn. And she listened without interruption, just occasionally jotting notes in a way that made me feel like she had already seen this exact story in different clothes many times before. When I finished, she leaned back slightly and said something that sounded almost too simple for how much stress had built up inside me. She said, "This is trespass, clear and straightforward." And the moment she said it, I felt a strange mix of relief and frustration. Relief, because finally someone with authority was naming it for what it was, and frustration, because if it was that simple, why had it already taken over so much of our daily lives? She explained that property law does not care about intention or community sentiment. What matters is access, permission, and boundary, and without those being respected, the law is actually very direct and very unforgiving. A formal letter was sent to St. Andrew's Chapel requesting immediate cessation of all pedestrian crossing over our property, and I genuinely thought that would be the end of it, not because I was naive, but because I believed institutions, especially ones that preach respect and morality, would respond to a clear legal notice. But instead, what came back surprised me. It was not an apology or even a neutral acknowledgement. It was a response from the church's legal representative claiming that the path across our land was part of a long-standing and formal rite of passage used by the community for decades, predating our ownership, and therefore they considered it a historic pedestrian corridor that could not simply be revoked by a private homeowner. I remember reading that letter at the kitchen table while Elise stood beside me, quietly watching my reaction, and I laughed once, not because it was funny, but because it felt so detached from reality. We had lived there for years, and there had never been any path there, not legally, not historically, not even physically, until people created it with repetition and foot traffic. And now that repetition was being presented as evidence of rights, and that is when Patricia began pulling official records, county maps, deed filings, land surveys, everything that could possibly support or disprove their claim. And after several days of review, she confirmed what I already suspected. There was no easement, no recorded right-of-way, no historical designation, nothing that would justify what they were claiming. It was simply not true. But even as the legal side started to take shape, the real world outside our window was not slowing down. In fact, it was getting worse, because now something else had entered the situation, and that was narrative. Pastor Cole began addressing the situation indirectly during sermons, speaking about unity and shared spaces and community kindness. And while he never named us directly, it was clear enough to anyone paying attention that we were the obstacle. The implication spread quickly among the congregation, and suddenly what had once been quiet respect from neighbors began to shift into something colder. People who used to wave at us now avoided eye contact or looked at us with quiet disapproval as they passed through our yard, and the lawn itself became more damaged not just from foot traffic, but from what felt like emotional permission, like once people believe they are justified, they become less careful about the consequences. Elise stopped replanting the flowers at some point, not because she stopped caring, but because it felt like watching something beautiful get erased over and over again without any acknowledgement of effort. She told me one night that it felt like we were maintaining a memory that other people were actively trying to overwrite, and I did not have a response that could fix that feeling, so I just sat with it. The lawsuit was filed quietly, no public announcement, no confrontation, just legal motion following legal motion, and I told myself that this was the step that would finally bring order back into the situation. But what I did not anticipate was how slow justice feels when you are living inside the problem, because nothing changes immediately, not the behavior, not the perception, not the tension, and every Sunday became heavier than the last, like everyone was waiting for something to break. There was one morning I will never forget. I was standing at the edge of the porch, and I watched a man walk across our lawn carrying his child on his shoulders, and the child was laughing, pointing at birds, completely unaware of any conflict. And in that moment, I realized something uncomfortable, that most people involved in this situation were not thinking about property or law or ownership. They were simply following what felt easy and familiar, and that realization did not make me angry. It made me tired, because it meant the problem was not just legal, it was psychological and deeply human, and that is a much harder thing to fix. The courthouse in Ridgefield felt almost too ordinary for what was about to happen inside it. No dramatic architecture, no sense of weight, just beige walls, fluorescent lighting, and a quiet that made every small sound feel sharper than it should have been. Elise and I arrived early that morning and sat side by side in a wooden bench that had clearly been used by hundreds of other people dealing with problems they never imagined they would end up arguing in front of a judge. And across the aisle, Pastor Nathan Cole sat with his legal team, calm on the surface, but I could see the tension in the way he kept adjusting his papers, like stillness itself was difficult for him that day. The case was not emotional in the way people think court cases are emotional. There were no outbursts, no dramatic interruptions, just a steady exchange of documents, testimony, and photographs laid out one after another like pieces of a puzzle. The judge, a man named Stephen Caldwell, listened without expression as both sides presented their version of reality, the church describing tradition and community usage, an implied passage, while our attorney, Margaret Ellis, focused on something much simpler: property lines, recorded deeds, and the absence of any legal easement. At one point, aerial photographs were shown on the screen, and I remember seeing our lawn from above, the faint diagonal scar across the grass that had formed over months of repeated footsteps, and it struck me how something so physical could be created without ever being formally agreed upon, like a ghost trail made by habit alone. And then Margaret stood and walked the judge through the county records step by step, calm, precise, no emotion, just fact after fact, until there was nothing left in there argument that could stand on paper. When the church attorney tried to argue historical usage, the judge raised his hand slightly and asked a single question that changed the entire atmosphere of the room. He asked whether any recorded legal document existed granting public access or easement over the property, and the silence that followed lasted long enough to feel heavy, because there was no such document, and everyone knew it. When Judge Caldwell finally spoke, his tone was measured but absolute. He stated that repeated unauthorized use of private land does not create legal right, and that convenience, even when widely practiced, does not override property ownership. And he ordered immediate cessation of all crossing across our land, along with clear signage directing all foot traffic to the public sidewalk. And for the first time in years, I felt something loosen inside me, not victory exactly, but confirmation that reality still had structure. I remember walking out of that courtroom thinking it was finally over, that the decision would naturally reset everything. But I learned quickly that court rulings and human behavior do not always move at the same speed, because the very next Sunday, nothing changed. People still crossed, still followed the same worn diagonal path, like the ruling had never happened. And that was the moment I understood the difference between a legal decision and social compliance. One exists on paper, the other exists in habits. After 2 weeks of watching the same thing repeat itself, I stopped arguing, stopped waiting, stopped expecting announcements or apologies. I simply called a landscaping company and asked them to build something that behavior could not ignore, and they arrived early one morning with trucks and tools and a plan that did not involve persuasion, only permanence. We stood on the porch as they worked, digging deep along the entire boundary facing the church, removing the worn soil that had been shaped by months of footsteps and replacing it with something living and deliberate, a dense hedge of evergreen shrubs chosen specifically to grow thick and high over time, not as a statement of anger, but as a line that could not be casually stepped through. And while they planted, I remember Elise standing beside me quietly, watching, not smiling, not upset, just watching. Like something long unresolved was finally being put into place. By the end of the day, the change was already visible, a green wall forming where open access had once been, and it felt strange how something so simple could alter the entire rhythm of a place. But it did, because the next Sunday people arrived, as usual, walked toward the shortcut, as usual, and then stopped, because the shortcut no longer existed. There was confusion, some laughter, some irritation. A few people turned around immediately, others stood for a moment before slowly walking back to the sidewalk, like they were remembering something they had ignored for too long. And I did not say anything. I just stood there with my coffee, watching the shift happen in real time. That afternoon, Pastor Cole came to our gate, clearly frustrated, saying we had blocked community access, that we were dividing the neighborhood. And I did not raise my voice. I simply handed him a copy of the court order and told him quietly that 14 days had been given for compliance and none of them were used, and that was the end of the conversation. The church filed one last motion calling the hedge a spite barrier, but the judge dismissed it immediately, reaffirming our right to protect and landscape our property, and even ordered reimbursement for legal fees and repair costs. And after that, there was nothing left to argue. Years later, the hedge is still there, taller, now thick and fully grown, and sometimes when I look at it from the porch, I do not think about conflict anymore. I think about how easily invisible lines can disappear when people stop respecting them, and how difficult it becomes to restore them once they are gone. And I still wonder, sometimes not with anger, but with curiosity, whether this was ever really about a shortcut at all, or about something deeper in how people decide what belongs to everyone and what still belongs to someone. And I will leave it there, because I want to know what you think about it. If you were in my place, would you have let it go for the sake of community, or would you have drawn the same line? I did share your thoughts in the comments. I read them, and I am genuinely curious where people stand on this one.